The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning. The sound of papers shuffling, footsteps echoing on the marble floor, and the soft creak of the wooden benches filled the room with a heavy stillness, the kind that only comes before something unforgettable. At the center of it all sat Judge Harris, a man known for his calm composure and relentless sense of fairness. But even he could sense something different about today's case. The bailiff called out, "Case number 4187, State versus Aaron Blake." A young man in his late 20s walked in wearing a gray suit. His confidence bordered on arrogance. He sat at the defendant's table, exchanging glances with his attorney, a smirk tugging at his lips. He didn't look nervous, just impatient, like someone forced to attend a meeting that didn't matter. Across from him, a woman was slowly guided to the witness stand. She held a small white cane in one hand and the arm of a courtroom assistant in the other. Her eyes, pale and unfocused, stared into the distance. She wore a simple lavender dress, her silver hair neatly tied back. As she reached the stand, the assistant whispered, "Careful, ma'am. Just one more step." She smiled softly. "Thank you, dear. I've been walking blind for years now. I know my steps, but not my direction." The gallery stirred. People watched her with quiet empathy. Judge Harris leaned forward. "Please state your name for the record." "My name is Grace Miller," she said in a calm, steady tone. Her voice was soothing but carried something deeper, a lifetime of pain hidden beneath grace and composure. Subscribe to Sweet Justice for more true-hearted courtroom stories, where every verdict carries a lesson worth remembering. Grace was called to testify as a witness in a case of reckless driving that resulted in serious injuries. The defendant, Aaron Blake, had a reputation for speeding through city streets, confident that his father's influence would always protect him. But this time, things were different. The victim survived, and the evidence was piling up. Grace had nothing to do with this accident directly, yet she had been called to describe sounds from a similar crash years ago. She had lost her eyesight in that incident, a hit and run on a rainy night when a car veered off the road and changed her life forever. Aaron's lawyer rose from his chair, speaking in a smug tone. "Your Honor, with all due respect, my client believes this witness's testimony is irrelevant. She's blind. She cannot identify my client visually. Therefore, her input is purely emotional and inadmissible." Judge Harris frowned. "You'll watch your tone, counselor. Every voice deserves to be heard in this court, including hers." Grace turned her head slightly toward the judge's voice and smiled faintly. "Thank you, Your Honor." The defense lawyer muttered something under his breath, but Judge Harris caught it. "I suggest you remember where you are, Mr. Lawson. This courtroom values respect over arrogance." Aaron chuckled quietly, as if amused by the judge's tone. He leaned toward his lawyer and whispered, "Don't worry. This is a waste of time. She's blind. What can she prove?" But Grace's hearing was sharp, painfully sharp. Years of living without sight had trained her to pick up every inflection, every breath, every subtle vibration in the air. Her head tilted slightly toward Aaron's voice. Something inside her trembled, though she couldn't quite explain why. She heard that laugh before. Somewhere. Long ago. The prosecutor approached. "Mrs. Miller, I understand that you lost your vision in a car accident 12 years ago. Could you tell the court what you remember from that night?" Grace nodded, taking a deep breath. "It was raining hard," she began. "I was driving home from my night shift at the hospital. The road was slippery. I remember headlights coming too fast from behind me. And then a horn. A loud, angry horn. The sound of a car engine roaring." The courtroom fell silent, listening to every word. Grace's voice quivered slightly as she continued. "I remember trying to move aside. Then, her voice cracked. A crash. The metal screamed. The glass shattered. I woke up days later. In darkness. Permanent darkness." The prosecutor stepped closer. "Did you ever see the driver of that car?" "No," she whispered. "I only heard him. He said something before running away." Aaron's lawyer smirked. "Objection, hearsay." Judge Harris raised a hand. "Overruled. Continue." Grace pressed her lips together, thinking carefully. He said, "I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to happen." That voice. Young, shaken, but familiar. "I tried to remember it for years, Your Honor." Aaron's smirk faltered for a split second. He looked away, fidgeting with his wristwatch. The judge noticed. "Defendant, do you wish to say something?" Aaron cleared his throat. "No, Your Honor, just tired." But his pulse was visible in his neck and fast and uneven. The prosecutor glanced at Grace kindly. "Mrs. Miller, thank you for your courage. I have no further questions." Judge Harris nodded respectfully. "You may cross-examine." Aaron's lawyer stood, buttoning his coat dramatically. "Mrs. Miller, you claim you heard a voice 12 years ago during a traumatic accident, correct?" "Yes. And now you're here because you... What? You think you might recognize my client's voice?" Grace tilted her head. "I didn't say that." "Exactly. So you admit you have no proof this man had anything to do with your past?" Grace turned toward where she believed his voice was coming from. "Maybe not proof, but memory," he chuckled mockingly. "Memory fades, ma'am, especially after trauma. I sympathize with your loss, but you're confusing coincidence for evidence." Judge Harris interjected sharply. "Counselor, that's enough. You will not belittle a witness's condition in my courtroom." Grace sat still, her hands folded, her face unreadable. But inside something strange stirred. That laugh, that tone, that same rhythm in his voice. It wasn't the lawyer. It was the defendant. Aaron whispered something again to his attorney. Grace's head turned slightly, her breath catching. There it was. That same voice, her heart began to race. Her mind flashed back to the rain, the crash, the desperate whisper. "I didn't mean to." She gripped the stand, her knuckles white. "Your Honor," she said softly. Judge Harris looked up. "Yes, Mrs. Miller?" Her voice trembled. I know that voice." The room froze. Every head turned toward her. Aaron went pale. Grace's words cut through the silence like a blade. I know that voice." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The sound of shuffling feet, gasps, and murmurs filled the room, until Judge Harris struck his gavel sharply. Order in the court." Aaron shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. He tried to play it off, but a bead of sweat glistened on his forehead. Judge Harris turned toward Grace. "Mrs. Miller, you said you recognized the voice of the defendant?" Grace hesitated for a long moment. Her lips trembled slightly as she searched for the right words. "I'm not sure, but when he whispered earlier, it brought me back to that night. The same tone, the same trembling guilt in his words." The defense lawyer immediately stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. This is purely speculative and emotionally charged. The witness herself admits she's unsure." Judge Harris glanced at him sternly. "Your objection is noted. But I'd like to hear what the witness has to say." Grace swallowed hard. "When you lose your sight, Your Honor, you learn to listen, not just to words, but to the space between them. The pauses, the fear, the regret. That man's voice carries both." The gallery was dead silent now. Even the air felt still. Aaron's lawyer leaned forward. "Mrs. Miller, you're claiming you can identify someone based on a memory that's 12 years old?" "I'm not claiming," she said softly. "I'm remembering." Judge Harris leaned back in his chair, intrigued. "Mrs. Miller," he said carefully, "you said you heard the man who hit you say something before fleeing the scene. Could you repeat those words?" Grace nodded slowly, her fingers tightening on the stand. "He said, 'I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to happen.'" The prosecutor turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, if the court permits, I'd like to ask the defendant to read that same phrase aloud." A collective gasp moved through the courtroom. The defense attorney slammed his hands on the table. "Absolutely not. That would be theatrical and irrelevant." Judge Harris's expression hardened. "Counselor, the relevance will be determined by this court, not your objections." "The motion is granted." Aaron's face turned pale. His voice cracked slightly as he stammered. "Your Honor, this is absurd. I don't even remember what I said 12 years ago. This could ruin my reputation." "Mr. Blake," the judge said firmly, "you're on trial for reckless endangerment and obstruction. Your reputation is already under examination. Read the words." Aaron hesitated, his eyes darting toward his lawyer, who gave a reluctant nod. He stood up, adjusted his tie, and repeated the words. "I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to happen." The sound hung in the air like an echo from the past. Grace's lips parted slightly. Her body froze. Her hands shook as she whispered, "It's him." The courtroom went dead silent again. Every eye turned to the blind woman whose trembling voice carried more weight than any piece of evidence so far. Aaron's lawyer quickly intervened. "Your Honor, this is emotional manipulation. The witness is clearly traumatized and Enough, Judge Harris interrupted. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Mrs. Miller's reaction will be noted. Walked slowly toward Grace. Continue, Mr. Prosecutor. Mrs. Miller, could you tell us what makes you so certain? She took a deep breath. When I was hit that night, I remember the car stopping for just a moment. The driver stepped out. I could hear his shoes on the wet road, heavy boots dragging slightly on the left side, the sound of a chain on his wrist like a bracelet. And when he spoke, he had this hesitation before every word. That same hesitation is in this man's voice. Aaron instinctively pulled his sleeve down, hiding a silver chain bracelet that peeked from beneath his cuff. Judge Harris noticed. The room seemed to hold its breath. Grace continued, her voice soft but unwavering. Your Honor, I may be blind, but I see more with sound than most people see with their eyes. The prosecutor turned to the defendant. Mr. Blake, can you explain why you appear nervous? Aaron forced a smirk. Nervous? No, sir. Just frustrated that we're entertaining fairy tales instead of facts. But his arrogance cracked when the prosecutor opened a folder. Then perhaps you'll recognize this, he said, holding up a photograph. This is a picture of a silver chain bracelet found in your car after your recent arrest. Aaron blinked. His lawyer jumped in quickly. That proves nothing. It's a common accessory. The prosecutor ignored him. And this, he pulled out another document, is a record from 12 years ago. A hit and run involving a silver sedan registered under the name of Aaron Blake Sr., your father. The case was closed for lack of evidence. Judge Harris's eyes narrowed. Mr. Blake, were you driving your father's car 12 years ago? Aaron froze. I was a teenager back then. I barely had my license. That's not an answer, the judge pressed. Aaron's breathing grew uneven. I don't remember, Grace spoke softly. You do? Aaron's head snapped toward her, eyes wide. For the first time, the confidence in his face began to crumble. The prosecutor continued, Mrs. Miller, how old were you when you lost your sight? 34. And since then you've had several surgeries, correct? Yes, though none restored my vision. I learned to live without light. He nodded gently. Did you ever receive an apology or hear anything from the person responsible? She smiled sadly. No, sir. Only silence, then she tilted her head again. Until today. Aaron slammed his hand on the table. You don't know what you're talking about. I wasn't even there. Judge Harris glared at him. Sit down, Mr. Blake. Aaron's lawyer whispered urgently. Stop talking, but it was too late. The prosecutor seized the opportunity. Your Honor, we'd like to submit a new piece of evidence, a voice recording from the day of the current accident. It was captured by a nearby witness on their phone. He pressed play. The sound of screeching tires filled the courtroom, followed by a man's voice yelling, Oh no, not again! I didn't mean to. Gasps spread through the gallery. Grace covered her mouth. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Judge Harris looked visibly shaken. He leaned forward, studying the young man in front of him. Mr. Blake, care to explain that? Aaron's face was ghost white. He stuttered. It was just instinct. I didn't mean, his lawyer grabbed his arm. Don't say another word, but the damage was done. Grace turned toward the direction of Aaron's voice. Her tone softened, almost mournful. You've lived with this guilt for 12 years, haven't you? That's why you drive recklessly. Not because you don't care, but because you stopped believing you deserve forgiveness. Aaron's eyes glistened. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. Judge Harris looked at him carefully. Is that true? Aaron lowered his head. I didn't mean to hurt her. I was scared. My father told me to stay quiet, that he'd take care of it. I was 17. I thought it would all go away. A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Even the defense attorney stood speechless. Grace's voice quivered. You took away my sight, Aaron, but today, you gave me closure. Aaron's tears finally fell. I'm sorry, he whispered. Judge Harris let the silence linger before speaking. This court will take a recess before I decide the sentence. He struck the gavel once, and the sound echoed like a heartbeat through the chamber. As the crowd dispersed, Grace remained seated. She turned her face slightly upward, as if looking through the darkness toward a light only she could feel. The prosecutor approached her gently. Mrs. Miller, are you all right? She smiled faintly. Yes, I can't see him. But I heard his truth. That's all I ever wanted. From across the room, Aaron sat quietly, his face buried in his hands. For the first time in years, the mask of arrogance had vanished. leaving only the frightened boy he used to be. The bailiff guided Grace out of the courtroom, but before leaving she turned toward the sound of Aaron's quiet sobs. "Aaron," she said softly. He looked up startled. "I forgive you." He stared at her for a long moment, his lips trembling, unable to form words. The bailiff opened the door, and Grace stepped into the hallway, unblind, but somehow free. The courtroom filled once more as Judge Harris returned from recess. The murmurs from the gallery quickly faded when the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Harris presiding. Grace sat quietly, her hands folded on her lap. Aaron stood beside his attorney, his head lowered, eyes red and weary. The air felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for justice to speak. Judge Harris adjusted his glasses and looked at both of them before taking a deep breath. "This case," he began slowly, "is unlike most that come before me. It is not simply about guilt or innocence. It's about truth that's been buried under silence, and the price both victims and offenders pay when time pretends to heal what it never faced." He glanced toward Grace. "Mrs. Miller, your courage to confront your past has moved this court. Most people who lose their sight lose their hope. You, on the other hand, found your truth in darkness." Grace bowed her head respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor." Then he turned to Aaron Blake. "Mr. Blake, what you did 12 years ago was a tragedy, one that could have been forgiven with honesty. But instead of coming forward, you hid behind privilege, fear, and your father's influence. You let an innocent woman carry pain you caused while you built a life on lies." Aaron's voice cracked. "I know I was young and stupid, and my father—" Judge Harris interrupted sharply. "Your father is not on trial. You are." The young man fell silent. The judge leaned forward. "Tell me, Mr. Blake, when you heard Mrs. Miller forgive you, what did you feel?" Aaron hesitated. "Relief and shame. I realized that the person I hurt most is the one showing me mercy." The judge studied him for a moment, then asked something unexpected. "Do you know what mercy means, Mr. Blake?" Aaron frowned slightly. I think it means being forgiven even when you don't deserve it." The judge nodded. "That's correct. But it also means carrying the responsibility that comes with that forgiveness." He turned his gaze downward for a brief moment, and then said something that silenced the room completely. 12 years ago, I was the assistant district attorney assigned to that same hit-and-run case." Gasps filled the courtroom. Even the court stenographer froze mid-sentence. Aaron's lawyer blinked. "Your Honor, are you saying—" "Yes," Judge Harris said calmly. "I reviewed the case. I remember the evidence, the inconsistencies, and the sudden closure that was ordered by higher authorities. I didn't know the victim by name then, but I remember her story." Grace's lips parted. You were the prosecutor?" Judge Harris nodded, emotion breaking through his controlled tone. "Yes, and I failed you, Mrs. Miller. The system failed you. We let influence outweigh integrity. I've carried that regret ever since." A hush fell over the courtroom. Even Aaron's arrogance dissolved completely. He looked up, stunned. Grace's voice trembled as she said, "Then perhaps, Your Honor, we were both blinded. You by the system, me by that night. Maybe today we both see clearer." Her words hung in the air like a prayer. Judge Harris exhaled deeply, regaining composure. "This verdict will not undo the past, but it will define what we learn from it." He turned toward Aaron Blake. "Mr. Blake, the evidence, your own admission, and the emotional testimony presented in this court make it clear. You are guilty of reckless endangerment and obstruction of justice. However," he paused. The word "however" made the room tense again. "I also recognize that you've lived under the weight of guilt, that your confession was not extracted by force but by conscience, and conscience is the first step toward redemption." Aaron's lawyer looked uncertainly at him, then at the judge. Judge Harris continued, "You will serve 5 years in state prison, but with a condition. During your sentence, you will be assigned to a rehabilitation program assisting visually impaired victims of vehicular accidents. You will listen to their stories. You will help them rebuild their lives and maybe in doing so rebuild your own." Aaron's lips quivered. "Your Honor, I don't deserve that chance." Judge Harris looked at him firmly. "No one truly deserves forgiveness, Mr. Blake. That's what makes it sacred." Grace's hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "Your Honor, may I speak?" He nodded. "I don't ask for leniency," she said softly, "but I do ask that he learn to see again. not with his eyes but with his heart. What you just gave him is justice with compassion, and that's rarer than any punishment. The judge's eyes softened. Mrs. Miller, you have reminded this court why justice exists, not just to punish but to heal. He turned toward the bailiff. Please take Mr. Blake into custody. Aaron stepped forward, but before he was led away, he turned to Grace. Mrs. Miller, thank you for everything. Grace nodded, a single tear tracing down her cheek. Live the rest of your life proving that this moment wasn't wasted. The bailiff guided him away, and the heavy courtroom doors closed with a deep echo. Judge Harris took off his glasses, rubbing his eyes. For a moment, the stern figure behind the bench seemed simply human, a man carrying old ghosts and new lessons. He looked at Grace one last time. You once lost your sight, Mrs. Miller, but today you've helped this entire court see. She smiled faintly. Then maybe justice isn't blind after all. The judge gave a small nod. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck the sound block one final time. A sound that didn't just end a trial, but symbolized peace after 12 long years of silence. As Grace was guided out of the courtroom, she turned her face toward the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Though she could not see it, she felt its warmth, the light she thought she'd lost forever. And somewhere deep in her heart, she whispered, justice found its sight today. Weeks passed since that unforgettable day in court. The headlines had faded, but the echoes of Grace Miller's courage still whispered through the city's legal circles. Journalists called it the trial that gave justice its eyes back. For Judge Harris, it was something far more personal, a silent redemption that healed an old wound he had carried in the dark for over a decade. Late one evening, Judge Harris sat alone in his chambers, surrounded by dim stacks of unfinished paperwork. His robe hung loosely on the coat stand. The soft ticking of the wall clock filled the quiet space. He stared at the verdict file, State versus Blake, the name neatly typed but heavy with memory. He leaned back and murmured, 12 years of regret and 1 day of truth. Maybe that's what justice really means. On his desk sat a letter. The handwriting was neat, graceful, almost old-fashioned. It was from Grace Miller. He opened it again, though he'd already read it a dozen times. Your Honor, I've spent most of my life thinking justice was something far away, something that happened in buildings I couldn't see, with people I couldn't touch. But that day in your courtroom, I realized justice is a voice, and sometimes it sounds like our own. Thank you for reminding me that truth can heal even when sight cannot. Grace Miller. He folded the letter carefully, his eyes glistening. Outside his window, city lights shimmered like distant stars, the kind of light Grace could no longer see, yet somehow helped everyone else rediscover. Months later, Grace made her way to the correctional facility where Aaron Blake was serving his sentence. She wore a simple navy coat and carried a white cane. The prison guard escorted her down the narrow hallway, each footstep echoing sharply. Aaron sat in the visitation room, his face pale but changed. Gone was the polished arrogance he'd once worn. In its place was humility, and the quiet exhaustion of a man confronting his soul. When he heard the sound of her cane, he stood. Mrs. Miller, he said softly. Grace smiled faintly. You sound different, he nodded. Prison will do that. So will guilt. She took a seat across from him. Between them was a glass divider, but their words passed through like light through an open window. I wanted to thank you, Aaron began, not just for forgiving me, but for forcing me to face myself. At first I hated this place, but then I started working in the rehabilitation unit, helping other victims of car accidents. I met people who lost limbs, families, everything. For the first time I listened instead of talking. I think I understand now. Grace's voice was calm but resolute. It's not about punishment, Aaron, it's about change. Pain can destroy us or it can teach us. The choice is ours. He nodded slowly, emotion catching in his throat. I used to think people like me couldn't fall. Now I know falling is what teaches you how to stand. She smiled softly. Then stand tall, Aaron. Because when you walk out of here, you'll need to be someone better than the man who walked in. He lowered his head. You gave me that chance. I'll never waste it again. For a moment there was silence, not awkward, but peaceful. When the guard signaled the end of visiting time, Grace stood and placed her hand against the glass. Aaron mirrored it from the other side. She whispered, "Goodbye, Aaron." He replied, "No. Mrs. Miller, not goodbye, thank you." A few weeks later, Judge Harris was invited to speak at a local law university. The auditorium was full of aspiring lawyers and young judges. The event was titled, "Justice Beyond Vision." When he walked onto the stage, the students rose in respect. He began, "In my years on the bench, I've learned that justice isn't a perfect scale, and it's a mirror. It reflects who we are when no one's watching." He paused, then continued, his tone softening. "There was a time I thought justice meant being right. But one woman showed me it means being true. She couldn't see the man who hurt her, yet she recognized his voice. She couldn't see the courtroom, yet she restored its sight. Her name is Grace Miller, and her story taught me that law without compassion is blindness wearing a robe." The hall was utterly silent. Then slowly the audience rose in applause, not for the judge, but for the lesson he shared. The sun was setting over the city. Grace walked through the small park near her home, guided by her cane and the familiar crunch of gravel beneath her shoes. The world around her was painted in gold, though she could not see it, but she felt it. Children laughed in the distance. A soft breeze touched her face. For the first time in years, she didn't feel trapped by her blindness. She felt free. A passing stranger helped her cross the path, and she thanked him with a smile. Inside, she whispered to herself, "Justice doesn't need eyes, it needs heart." And somewhere, miles away, Judge Harris closed the file on her case one last time, whispering the same words. As the screen fades, the narrator's voice concludes the video. In a world that often confuses punishment with justice, one blind woman reminded us that seeing the truth takes courage. And sometimes, even without sight, the human spirit can illuminate the darkest courtroom. The gavel sound echoes, "Sweet justice."